Hello, friends. Welcome back to the cabin. My name is Tim Martin with Covenant Creation on YouTube. I have to say that I am excited for this episode today. I expect this material will provoke a number of aha moments for you as we go along. It brings together details introduced earlier in this series into a coherent perspective of biblical history, which will be key for our next video that concludes part 2 and marks the halfway point in this 2024 Covenant Creation Curriculum series. I'll explain more in the conclusion today. So let's dive right in. So today we have a new improved History of the Covenant Universe, Part 2, Section 5, titled Noah's Rest and Adam's Dominion. Now, remember from the forward and the outline of this curriculum series how Part 2 is focused on the big picture history of the Old Covenant creation. And I organized that to really revolve around Genesis 1 issues specifically. That history is crucial to understand properly since it prepares us to understand fulfillment in Jesus Christ and the promised new heavens and new earth covenant creation. Now, if you think about it very long, then it becomes obvious that a tremendous amount of misunderstanding regarding the New Testament story is rooted in a faulty and mistaken understanding of the Old Testament. Preterists know how that works with prophecy, but the same issue applies to many other aspects of theology just as profoundly. So getting the story wrong in the Old Testament will result in a mistaken reading of the New Testament without fail. Now, it's impossible to completely separate Genesis 1 with Adam's introduction and the story of Adam in Genesis 2 through 3 as a separate topic. But my goal is to focus on the garden scene heavily in the upcoming part 3, titled Adam the First Son, Genesis the First Bible. And we're almost ready for that. But this session opens up the big picture and how the story of Adam at creation and Noah's flood sets the stage for the rest of the Old Testament and details for the coming of Jesus. Now, I should probably start here by explaining my method and my madness. It's probably best to show you that this whole curriculum series is designed as a spiral curriculum. And you might ask me, well, what is that? What is a spiral curriculum? Well, a spiral curriculum is one in which there is an iterative revisiting of topics, subjects, or themes throughout the course. A spiral curriculum is not simply the repetition of a topic taught. It requires also the deepening of it with each successive encounter, building on the previous one. Each return visit has added objectives and presents fresh learning opportunities, leading to the overall objectives. Every visit can bring new knowledge or skills relating to the theme or topic, and more advanced applications of areas previously covered. New information or skills introduced are related back and linked directly to learning in previous phases of the spiral. Previous learning is a prerequisite for the later learning. As the student spirals upwards in a course of study, as new knowledge and skills are introduced in subsequent lessons, they reinforce what is already known and become intertwined with previous learned information. Now, I thought that was a really good explanation of what a spiral curriculum it is, and I mention it here because the episode background for Noah's Rest and Adam's Dominion today would be these previous sessions. Thorns and Thistles, Part 1, Section 1, Covenant Population and Mankind, Part 1, Section 3, and Covenant Population and the Animals, Part 1, Section 4. So if this is your first experience of this series, please realize that the groundwork was established back in those episodes for many conclusions that we build on today. And I invite you to dig into that background if you find the content interesting today, but have not actually seen the previous episodes. Now, Genesis 1 gives us the big picture for something extremely significant, given how much this dominion mandate is repeated across the Old Testament. It all begins here. Then God said, "Let us make man," be Adam, "in our image according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, over all the earth, and that's eretz or gi, depending on the Hebrew or Greek, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, eretz, gi. So God created man, Adam, in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female. He created them. Then God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. Have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth." Genesis 1:26-28. Now, G.K. Beale explains why this becomes important to understand in the unfolding Old Testament narrative. He explains it this way. As we will see, after Adam's failure to fulfill God's mandate, God raises up other Adam-like figures to whom this commission is passed on. We will find that some changes in the commission occur as a result of sin entering the world. Adam's descendants, like him, however, will fail. Failure will continue until there arises a last Adam who will finally fulfill the commission. And that's a great quote because it highlights how this introduction in Genesis 1 is the beginning of what is to come in the story, all the way out to the fulfillment in Christ. It's all connected. And today we're going to look at one of those changes in this dominion mandate. But he goes on to say as well, some commentators have noticed that Adam's commission was passed on to Noah, to Abraham, and on to his descendants. So the issue of worship and the Adam's mission continues even after Adam and Eve are sent into exile, because we see that Abel offered the firstborn from his flocks in Genesis chapter 4. And that's a detail, as we've seen, that is also specific to Deuteronomy 12:6 as a law for Israel. But notice another detail about worship and Adam's family toward the end of Genesis 4, where we read this. And as for Seth, to him also a son was born, and he named him Enosh. Then men began to call on the name of the Lord, and that is Yahweh in Genesis 4:26. Isn't it interesting that the name for God in that passage is Yahweh, not Elohim? It's the covenant name for God as revealed to Israel, which matches our Adam-Israel relationship in the story. It's also the name for God used in Genesis 2-3, but not in Genesis chapter 1. So the nuance of Adam-Israel in the story is clearly in the background, even if it doesn't come across with the generic term God as translated into English. So this is Yahweh who is worshipped in the godly line of Seth, which every later Israelite would recognize instantly. Now, the Hebrew scholar John Sailhammer makes this note about Genesis 4:26 and how it fits into the wider Pentateuch narrative. He says, the importance of the blessing in Genesis 1, verse 28 cannot be overlooked. Throughout Genesis and the Pentateuch, the blessing remains a central theme. At that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord, 4:26. Such a note is a sign that, for the author, the worship of the Lord established at the time of Moses was not something new, but rather a restoration of the worship of the only and true God. At least as far as the line of Seth was concerned, these men, like Abraham after them, are described as true worshipers of the covenant God. Now that fits very well into the covenant creation perspective of Genesis as the beginning of the old covenant creation. Once again, recognized by top Hebrew scholarship today. And it also brings us to Genesis 5 and the beginning of Noah's genealogy from Seth, beginning with Adam. So the covenant line of Seth, Yahweh worshipers, provides the covenant context for the entire flood story that is a part of this genealogical history. For example, I'll give you some examples from James B. Jordan. It says, it seems though that the godly line of Seth fell away 3 generations later, and I'm assuming he's talking about from Enoch, Only Noah was left to find favor in God's sight. And that's an important detail to acknowledge because Cain was driven from the face of the ground back in Genesis 4, and he's off building cities and marrying multiple wives. Cain is actually the source and origin of polygamy in the Bible. So, somewhere in the background out there is Cain, but the flood account is presented in the context of this godly Seth line of Yahweh worshipers, following the Adam Israel nuance of the story. J. Vernon McGee wrote this in his book on Genesis. He says, in Genesis chapter 5, we have the book of the generations of Adam through Seth. Cain's line has been given to us and is now dropped. It will be mentioned again only as it crosses the godly line. And what's most interesting is that the entire flood story is folded into this genealogy of Noah from Adam through Seth. Consider this explanation. The genealogical list in chapter 5 has been purposefully restructured at its conclusion in order to accommodate the flood narrative. The flood narrative has been inserted into the genealogy between the notation of the total length of Noah's age at the time he engendered his 3 sons, 532, and the notation of his total length of his life, 928, and his death, 929. That's from John Sailhammer, which Josephus also confirms this context with the line of Seth when he opens up his record of the flood. He says, now this posterity of Seth. So the flood is related to the line of Seth within the genealogy of Noah. And most Christians assume that the flood begins in Genesis 6, but the context of the flood is Genesis 5 and the line of Seth, who Genesis 4 says and informs us are true worshipers of Yahweh, Israel's covenant-making God. So this detail has tremendous importance because it gives a biblical context to the flood story rather than a geological or modern science context that is so often simply assumed or read into the flood story, as is common for Christians today. Now, I just want to introduce that here because Noah's flood is about the gospel of Jesus Christ, not geology or modern science. In much the same way that we saw in the last episode, how the firmament of Genesis 1 is about Jesus and the gospel, not about some description of physical universe cosmology. It's common for Christians to try to make these things about science because our modern scientific worldview and epistemology. But these are the modern priorities of scientism. The Bible's focus is on the priority of covenant, not science. And the very same issues relate to eschatology when futurists assume eschatology is about the end of the physical universe in some kind of scientific description of a worldwide tribulation and judgment day to come at the end of the world. It's the same problem that we see in Genesis, just applied consistently to eschatology, and both are related errors because they both deny covenant context. So Noah's flood is a judgment on a covenant world, the apostate line of Seth, who started as Yahweh worshipers, just like Israel had become at the end of the age. So this should probably sound familiar to you. And if you want to investigate this covenant context for Noah's flood, which parallels another covenant judgment event to come upon the generation of Jesus and the apostles, then I will simply refer you to Beyond Creation Science, chapters 6 through 10, for your own examination. But this leads us to a fascinating observation. This statement, later in Genesis 5, says that Noah would provide rest or comfort, depending on your English translation. The name Noah literally means rest or comfort, depending on how you handle that. But specifically, it is rest or comfort from the toil of their hands. Again, the context here is the line of Seth, Adam to Noah, and God's curse on the ground. So we read this: Lamech lived 182 years and had a son, and he called his name Noah, saying, This one will comfort or rest us concerning our work and the toil of our hands, because the ground which the Lord has cursed. Genesis 5:28 and through 29. Now, you probably understand where we go next. Where is the backstory for this found? Remember, it is all connected here, and the story is making those connections for us. Obviously, it is this text at the center of our part 1, section 1, titled Thorns and Thistles, Genesis 3:17 through 18. Then to Adam he said, because you have heeded the voice of your wife and have eaten from the tree of which I commanded you, saying you shall not eat of it, cursed is the ground for your sake. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life, both thorns, exanthus, and thistles, tribulus, according to Septuagint, it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the herb of the field. Genesis 3:17 through 18. Now, commentators on this passages have a multitude of mutually exclusive conclusions and conflicting opinions about what this passage actually means. Even critics of covenant creation don't agree with themselves about what Genesis 5:28 through 29 is talking about. I get arguments from various directions, and the critics don't even agree with themselves, and they're all trying to refute covenant creation. And it's kind of funny because you would think they would get their own view straight first before attacking covenant creation, but no, that takes some work, I guess, to get everybody on the same page. But here's the key to the whole thing. What does everyone assume Genesis 3:17 through 18 is talking about without question? Well, they all assume Genesis 3:17 through 18 is referring to a material biological curse on the planet Earth, right? It's just their unexamined presupposition that flows right out of their physical world context of creation for Genesis 1 through 3. God made the physical world in Genesis 1, and then God cursed the physical world in Genesis 3. Simple, right? And if preterists thought through the implications of the completed redemption of Jesus Christ in the first century, it wouldn't be so simple, but preterists have a lot of traditions that they are absolutely dedicated to regarding Genesis creation. So they make them completely different topics. Genesis 1 through 3 is about the physical universe creation, and then Bible eschatology is about something completely different. Covenant eschatology, right? And they wonder why more and more people in preterism conclude that doesn't make sense. I mean, well, the reason is it doesn't make sense. It's really traditions that are driving the bus, so to speak, on the creation subject for some preterists. They love their traditional view of Genesis 1 through 3. So as a result of this physical universe material curse view, resulting in biological weeds and thorns, supposedly, on the entire world, whether you take that as worldwide or the globe, there are basically three options left, or that sort of determine how you take Genesis 5. So one would be that Noah and the flood resulted in the full removal of the thorns and thistles from the material creation, right? Number two would be the curse on the ground was alleviated. The thorns and thistles are partly removed, but not fully removed as a result of Noah and the flood. Think of this as somehow the biological curse was lessened as a result of the event. And there's a third position out there that God did not remove the thorns and thistles from the ground at all in fulfillment of Genesis 5:28 and 29, but simply made it more bearable or more tolerable in some way. And one proposal says this is the natural result of God giving animals to Noah and his family to eat in Genesis 9. So human beings wouldn't have to subsist just on herb-based crops that are always negatively impacted by physical thorns and thistles, right? You can actually find a sermon on that from Genesis 3 on the playlist of this station titled Non-Covenant Creation Preterist Teaching on Genesis Creation. which makes this most interesting claim. Now, all three of those positions have their own problems that prove unconvincing to each other. So the material reading of the meaning of Genesis 5:28 through 29 is all over the map. Consider option 1. Did Noah and the flood remove all thorns and thistles from planet Earth? Then why do they still exist in our world today? Furthermore, why are thorns and thistles referenced in the prophets as an ongoing problem to be resolved by Messiah in places like Isaiah 65:23, no longer labor in vain? Paul even notes the ongoing curse in Genesis 3 detail in his teaching in Romans chapter 8. For the creation was subjected to futility, drawing explicitly and heavily from Genesis chapter 3. So the curse isn't really removed completely until the coming and work of Messiah. Consider option 2. Did Noah and the flood partly remove the thorns and thistles curse of Genesis 3:17 through 18? What would that mean? Was it only the local place where Noah and his family lived? Then the weeds can't come back everywhere later, just like we have today? In other words, is this sort of like a partial removal of the thorns and thistles of Genesis chapter 3, the curse on the ground? Well, if that's the case, then this is completely irrelevant now in history in any physical sense. Now consider option 3. The curse of thorns and thistles continues forever and ever, as that sermon on Genesis 3 I referenced above teaches. And that is problematic to say the least, because after the completion of Jesus' work, who came to reverse the curse and redeem God's people who lived under the curse, are still living with thorns and thistles. Furthermore, if this is about human beings starting to eat animals for the first time, then all kinds of questions might come to mind about God's original creation order and the wider story of Genesis. Now, I will come back to that shortly, but clearly anyone who suggests eating animals alleviates the ground curse has never really done any work related to livestock husbandry and certainly doesn't understand the effort and time it takes to bring animals to maturity, sometimes years, and then the work that it takes to butcher those animals and prepare the meat. I mean, the thorns and thistles affect the pasture for animals too, correct? Or, you could imagine hunting with primitive weapons if we're not talking about domesticated animals in Genesis chapter 9. Is this a realistic meaning of the fulfillment of Genesis 5:28 through 29? Well, I'll come back to this in a bit. But here's an alternative that does work. Do you remember what the biblical definition of thorns and thistles is in covenant history? How about Noah's rest and comfort in covenant context? Well, it's important to first define the curse in Genesis 3:17 through 18 in biblical context. And this is the precise mistake of all physical universe views of Genesis 1 through 3. And it's also why they all disagree with each other about the meaning of Genesis 5:28 through 29. Nothing works when you start with that definition because it's a wrong, mistaken reading. Well, do you remember in part 1, section 1 of this series that the biblical definition of thorns and thistles is covenant apostates? And what happened to the wicked line of Seth in Noah's day? So he destroyed all living things which were on the face of the ground. That's the same Hebrew word as Genesis chapter 3. Both man and cattle, creeping things and bird of the air, they were destroyed from the earth. Only Noah and those who were with him in the ark remained alive. Genesis 7:23. So Noah's ark provided salvation through the baptismal judgment by water, and these covenant apostates were removed at the conclusion of the story. The thorns and thistles were wiped out. Noah's salvation in the ark brought rest to God's faithful people, which at this point is Noah's family. We saw how this precise language of Genesis 3 comes up again in Hebrews 6, 7, and 8. in reference to covenant apostates in the first century who were about to be destroyed by fire, just as the covenant apostates were destroyed by water in Noah's day. So we see this parallel. From Genesis 3, cursed is the ground for your sake. Both thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the herb of the field. Now compare that to Hebrews chapter 6. For the earth, Gi, which drinks in the rain that often comes upon it, and bears herbs useful for those by whom it is cultivated, receives blessing from God. But if it bears thorns, acanthus, and briars, tribulus, same Greek words as the Septuagint, it is rejected and near to being cursed, whose end is to be burned. So note how that text in Hebrews, as sourced in Genesis 3, confirms that there were more thorns and thistles in the first century awaiting their judgment day as well. So it's not at all like thorns and thistles were removed entirely for all time, for all of history with Noah's flood. That's not even a contextual reading of Genesis chapter 5, verse 28 and 29. It's not warranted. So Jesus even spoke about the parable of the wheat and the tares about his day. The thorns and thistles infesting the covenant ground of Israel were about to be wiped out in that generation as well. I mean, didn't Jesus say something like, it'll be like the days of Noah that are coming? So putting all this together, Genesis 5:28 refers to the evil line of Seth of his generation who tormented Noah due to their wickedness. The parallel here is 2 Peter 2:7 and the destruction of Sodom, which is repeatedly drawn as a comparison to the flood in New Testament prophetic texts. But what does Peter say about the wicked in Lot's day? Peter says, righteous Lot was oppressed by the wicked until they were destroyed with Sodom and Gomorrah. So the same thing is going on with Noah and the wicked line of Seth in his day. Noah's rest or Noah's comfort makes perfect sense given the biblical definition of thorns and thistles as covenant apostates, as covenant creation explains from the beginning. And once you begin with that definition of Genesis 3 as the detail of God's covenant curse on the covenant ground, having nothing whatsoever to do with the physical world at all, then the whole narrative makes perfect sense. God destroyed the wicked, giving rest and comfort to the faithful. Noah preserved the faithful in the ark and emerged as inheritor of the land. The wicked, thorns and thistles who infested the ground of God's covenant world were wiped out. But what happens next? Noah found himself in a new garden with wine, and we see a new fall because Noah did not protect his wife. And Genesis 9 ends with a new curse. So covenant apostates spring from the covenant ground in Noah's own family after the flood, sort of like Cain in Adam's family 10 generations earlier. Now, these details come up again in part 3 and part 4 of this series because the result of the flood is that God gives judgment over to Noah and his family to execute. Do you remember back in Genesis 3 who pronounced the curse? Well, in Genesis 3, God judges Adam and Eve. But here at the end of the flood story and the Noahic covenant, judgment is given to Noah, Israel, from this point forward. Stay tuned why that's important. We'll examine it closely in part 3. And then in part 4, I will develop what happens when modern Christians believe this curse of the Noahic covenant on Ham remains ongoing even today. You know, that's actually a futurist view. That view denies that this covenant world has passed away. And that belief had tremendous implications for modern culture and society, especially within the American context related to the antebellum American South before Lincoln. A lot of people died, and one of the theological arguments for slavery and defense of the South, as promoted by R.L. Dabney, was the application of the ongoing curse on Ham to Black people. Yes, there are major implications for misreading the Bible, and people die because of it. So we're living in the aftermath of that history and the wake of that theological error even today. We'll get into it. It's all coming in part 4 with the conclusion of this series. But Noah's rest was fulfilled in Noah's day with the destruction of the wicked thorns and thistles in the apostate line of Seth, who began as Yahweh worshipers. It's so simple when you start with the biblical definition of thorns and thistles in Genesis 3. And it kind of makes you chuckle when you hear wild theories coming out of both critics and traditional expositors. They seem completely stumped and will always promote their confusion and incoherence because of their material creation presuppositions. The curse is gone. No, it's not. There are still weeds today. Hey, it's about killing animals and eating meat because that makes life easy. What a mess. So, anyway, that gets us all prepared to go into this idea that God has a war against covenant apostates. And we saw that with the Sethite Yahweh worshippers, and it explains significant imagery and detail in the flood account, especially in Genesis 9. Do you realize that the bow set in the clouds is actually God's instrument of war? Right? Here's the text. Then God spoke to Noah and to his sons with him, saying, "And as for me, behold, I establish my covenant with you and with your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the cattle, and every beast of the earth with you. Of all that go out of the ark, every beast of the earth. Thus I establish my covenant with you. Never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood. Never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth." And God said, "This is the sign of the covenant which I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for perpetual generations." And if you look at that in the Young's literal, it's age during, right? This is the old covenant age. I set my rainbow, and it doesn't say rainbow in Hebrew, it is literally bow, as in an instrument of war, in the cloud, and it shall be for the sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Genesis chapter 9. So, like a warrior who hangs up his bow after battle, God's renewed covenant brings peace to God's people, as represented by Noah. And God never again wiped out all nations together in one simultaneous covenant judgment, as we see with the destruction of all breath-based life in the story of Noah's flood. But God is still a warrior who executes covenant judgment at appropriate times in covenant history. And I like how David Chilton brings the story of Noah's flood into the parallel context of another covenant context of judgment to come later in Israel's history. Watch this citation from David Chilton. He says, "We should ask a rather obvious question at this point, so obvious that we are apt to miss it altogether. Where did Christ get the bow in Revelation 6:2? The answer, as is usually the case, begins in Genesis. When God made the covenant with Noah, he declared that he was no longer at war with the earth because of the soothing aroma of the sacrifice. And as evidence of this, he unstrung his bow and hung it up in the cloud for all to see. It was thus necessary that the first writer should be seen carrying the bow of God's vengeance to signify the unleashing of the curse upon Israel's ground. For these covenant apostates, the Noahic covenant is undone." So God's war bow is God's weapon used against covenant apostates all across the Bible. And you can see examples of it in places like Deuteronomy 32, which links the flood story to Israel's covenant as well. Revelation 6:2, Lamentations 2, Habakkuk 3, all of which are explicitly in the context of Israel. So the conclusion here is that Noah is the continuation of the story of Adam. Seth's line worshiped Yahweh, the covenant God of Israel, which leads to Abraham and Israel later. And that makes the Noahic covenant one aspect of the old covenant creation related to Israel. Now, not only is the covenant, the flood account, given in the covenant context of the line of Seth, it is also related to everything that comes later as well. John Sailhammer explains the worship context well. He says the author apparently saw that the flood and Noah's sacrifice played an important part in the cleansing of humankind after the fall and in preparation for God's renewed covenant, first with Noah and then with Abraham. All in all, this strategy places the covenant of Abraham within a much broader context and shows that God's purposes in creation were continued in the call of Abraham and the covenant at Sinai. Now, you and I both know that the blood of animals can never cleanse the worshiper in any real sense. So Sailhammer's point here needs to be taken in the context and meaning of all the sacrifices of the old covenant as typological pictures of Messiah to come. In fact, the whole story of the flood is typological at that level and points forward to Jesus. Noah is a 10th from Adam, a type of Christ, just as Jesus is a consummation man. The flood is a type of the greater end of the age judgment, with a new ark of salvation being the church. Noah's sacrifice leads to the pleasing aroma and the peace covenant, which is a type of the new covenant that brings peace between God and his people. The flood is parallel to the Great Tribulation on Israel in places like Matthew 24, Luke 17, 2 Peter 3, and Revelation chapter 6. Jesus spoke of a coming great storm and coming flood in Matthew chapter 7. And the house that was built on the rock would last, whereas the house on the sand would end in a great crash. Only Messiah could reverse the curse in true fulfillment, as we see in places like Isaiah 27, Isaiah 65, Romans 8, Revelation 21, and 22. So everything that is involved in the story is pointing forward to Jesus, which is why, once again, when Christians make this story out to be about geology or modern science, then it is just a modernistic approach to Genesis due to the effects of scientism on modern Christians. So if your concern is about modern science, then you have a modernistic theology of creation and flood. So a typological reading of Noah's flood actually fits into the wider context of the Old Testament, sometimes explained as double fulfillment or dual fulfillment. Personally, I prefer the term typological fulfillment because types always point forward to the complete fulfillment in Jesus, who is the antitype, the goal, or telos of the entire story. But here are some examples to consider of how this works in the Bible to sort of put Noah's flood and fulfillment in context. Again, Noah's 10th from Adam, a consummation man, a type of Christ who gives true rest. The promised land promised to Abraham and received by Abraham's children was a type and fulfilled ultimately in Christ, according to Hebrews chapter 4. Abraham looked forward to a heavenly city. He looked forward to New Jerusalem. Solomon extended the kingdom dominion over all nations, which is a type that is fulfilled in Christ. And this one's my favorite, actually. Daniel's 70 years of exile, fulfilled as a type, is the basis for Daniel's 70 weeks prophecy as the greater captivity that can only be accomplished to restoration in Jesus Christ. Another one that is usually overlooked is that Eve believed Cain fulfilled God's promise, and Abel and Seth are both messianic figures, according to Genesis chapter 4. It's overlooked that Eve actually looked at her offspring as fulfillment of Genesis chapter 3, verse 15 in the Proto-Evangelium, which we know, of course, is ultimately about Jesus Christ. We have the restoration and rebuilt temple after exile, which is a type that pictured the new temple of Ephesians 2. And finally, we have the office of priest and king reunited in Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, which is a type fulfilled in Christ, going back to Zechariah 6. And Adam and Melchizedek are both priest kings. And that's the reason why the office of priest and king must be reunited in the last Adam in typological fulfillment. So, putting this all together, the central claim of covenant creation is fairly obvious. Genesis 1 inaugurates Old Covenant history, and you can examine Hebrews 11, which makes that very plain as well. Noah's rest fits perfectly into this biblical pattern and typological development. The wicked thorns and thistles were destroyed, but that typological fulfillment always looked forward to the greater Noah to come, the true sacrifice to bring peace between God and his people, the fulfilled new covenant. And now we can see how this Adamic dominion is actually extended through Noah as first introduced in Genesis chapter 1, because we have this repetition in Genesis chapter 9. So God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." That would be Genesis 1 language. "And the fear of you and the dread of you shall be on every beast of the earth, on every bird of the air, on all that move on the earth, and all the fish of the sea. They are given into your hand. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. I have given you all things, even as the green herbs." And that's a direct reference back to Genesis 1:28 through 30, where both Adam and the animals are given the same food to eat. So we can understand the dominion mandate goes from Adam in Genesis chapter 1 to Noah in Genesis chapter 9, is repeated to Abraham, and we see it coming through with Israel as well, following that theme of Adam being the corporate body of Israel. But there's the new element introduced here for Noah, who has been given judgment by God. And that's the context in the background that we'll get to more in part 3. Now God introduces fear and dread on all the animals, and he gives the animals as food for Noah and his family. And to understand this in biblical context, we need to recognize some details up front. First of all, fear and dread on the animals is not a result of the original creation in Genesis chapter 1. God gave the herbs to eat both to Adam and the animals in Genesis 1. And this passage makes direct link back to that text. We should also note that it's not present in the garden in Genesis 2 when God brought the animals to Adam. There was no fear and dread in the garden, for they are introduced here later, and Adam had interaction with the animals for God's purposes. Also note that it's not introduced with the fall in Genesis chapter 3, as young earth creationist traditionalism assumes. Again, this idea that bloodletting and biological death result from the curse of Genesis 3 is a baseless tradition promoted by young earth creationism, a failure to recognize the covenant context of creation and fall. It's just raw tradition. It is not introduced, actually, until Genesis chapter 9 after the flood. So what I'm saying here is that this does not fit a biological reading expectation of our physical world experience at all. In other words, it's symbolic. And if you remember our previous part 1, section 4, covenant population of the animals, then you know the animals are symbols for nations and people groups, separate from Adam and the priestly line. I should also mention that the historical dimension of Genesis confirms the symbolic approach. Why do I say that? Well, Abel is keeper of sheep who brought firstborn of his flock and their fat, like a good Israelite, kept sheep for food back in Genesis chapter 4. And all the examples in scripture of keeping flocks of sheep is for the express purpose of food, as was common in the ancient Near East culture and world at this time. So generic human diet was the same as it is today. Jesus doesn't accomplish redemption to change our diet, right? It's just bad theology from traditionalist conceptions. Genesis 9 cannot be about some generic change to human diet worldwide. To make that argument or import that idea is to introduce a self-contradiction into the early chapters of Genesis, since Abel was a keeper of flocks and references to their fat, a food term in Genesis 4. But now we can start to see how the covenant creation view starts to make sense directly from the text. Notice the phrase in Genesis 9:2, they are given into your hand. That's a phrase that is used often about what? It usually comes up in relation to whether Israel should attack someone, right? It's used all through the Old Testament, referring to national conquest. This diet stipulation in Genesis 9 is referring to kingdom consumption. When one nation defeats another nation, it is presented as eating one another. And Noah and his family, the Adam-Israel link, is supposed to be at the top of the food chain, right? This is a reference to the Adam-Israel priority during the Old Covenant creation. It could be typological in the sense that it's prophetic of Acts chapter 10, as we saw in the previous episode regarding covenant population and the animals. But the question is, how is this detail in Genesis 9 fulfilled in that context and the story of Israel that flows from Adam and Noah and Abraham? Well, the key is to follow the language out and watch the detail in the text. Check out how Exodus chapter 1 opens the story by connecting all this detail from earlier in Genesis to the Exodus events. But the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly, multiplied, and grew exceedingly mighty. Reference to Genesis 1 and Genesis 9. And the land, Eretz, same word as Genesis chapter 1, was filled with them. So what do we have here with Israel? They are filling the earth, as in past, fulfilled. Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph, and he said to his people, look, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and it happen in the event of war, that they also join our enemies and fight against us, and so go up out of the land. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with their burdens, and they built for Pharaoh supply cities, Pithom and Ramses, but the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. And they were in dread of the children of Israel. Reference to Genesis chapter 9. So Pharaoh and Egypt lived in dread of Israel. And that's actually part of the motivation behind the hard bondage, according to Exodus chapter 1. Now, is that just a coincidence that multiple elements of the Genesis 9 dominion mandate all come up in Exodus 1 together again? It just happens that way, right? I don't think that's a coincidence at all. Remember how G.K. Beale explained the unfolding of the story here. And I've used this quote before, but for sake of review, consider the significance again of what he says. He says, the reason that Jesus reflects both the Old Testament figures of Adam and Israel is because, as we have seen earlier, Israel and her patriarchs are given the same commission, as was Adam in Genesis 1. Consequently, it is not an overstatement to understand Israel as a corporate Adam who had failed in their Garden of Eden, in much the same way as their primal father had failed in the first garden. For these reasons, it is understandable that Jesus is called Son of God, partly because that was a name for the first Adam, and for Israel, likewise the expression Son of Man, Adam, from Daniel chapter 7, refers to end-time Israel and her representative, King, as the son of Adam, who is sovereign over beasts. Recall that the Son of Man, that'd be Adam, takes over the kingdoms of former evil empires portrayed as beasts. Now, does that detail in Genesis 9, fear and dread and eating meat for the first time, start to make some sense? Noah has grown up from Adam's childlike position in the garden. We will explore this development in part 3. But God's people from Noah's day are ready for steak, not just plant-based baby food. And boy, does the story get wild from here. Pun intended. The fear and dread of Genesis chapter 9 becomes a prominent theme during not just Egyptian captivity with Pharaoh in Egypt, but also the following conquest after the Exodus. Deuteronomy 11, then the Lord will drive out all these nations from before you. No man, and I have to point out here, the word for man here is Ish, not Adam. The land is filled with Ish, and the Adams are coming in with Joshua. No man, no Ish, shall be able to stand against you. The Lord your God will put the dread of you and the fear of you upon all the land where you tread, just as he has said to you. The reason that language looks familiar in English is because both the Hebrew phrase and the Greek Septuagint have the same words and phrasing as Genesis 9:2, which reads, and the fear of you and the dread of you shall be on every beast of the earth, on every bird of the air, on all that move on the earth, on all the fish of the sea. They are given into your hand. That's a kingdom conquering phrase. So that's a beautiful text in parallel with Deuteronomy chapter 11. The covenant creation reading of covenant population with both mankind as the Adams, as Israel, and the animals as foreign nations is explicitly confirmed in Deuteronomy 11 as compared to Genesis 9:2. Moses spoke directly and explicitly from Genesis 9 about Israel's conquest. The conquest is a fulfillment of exactly what was intended in Genesis 9. Now, covenant creation has received a lot of criticism for its emphasis on the biblical definition of animal symbolism in the Pentateuch. But doesn't this appear very obvious that the covenant creation approach is vindicated by Deuteronomy 11? Why would Moses use the exact same details and wording and phraseology as Genesis 9:2 in his statement if that symbolic reading of Genesis 9 is entirely false? Does Moses just make up a brand new definition for use in Deuteronomy that's entirely different than the definition that we see in Genesis chapter 9? So I'll make a challenge to you critics of covenant creation who are watching this video. You need to give some answers about this biblical detail. Is Moses mistaken to use Genesis 9:2 language like this in relation to nations being driven out by Adam, Israel? So if you think you have a biblical case for your literal reading of Genesis 1 and 9 as a physical universe description, and these are just physical biological animals, then let's see it. Write an article, do a video, preach a sermon, or something. I mean, I suspect you won't do it because you can't refute covenant creation from the text of Scripture. That's why you want to talk about modern science or philosophy, and you run from texts like this because they confirm the covenant creation model plainly. The way I see it, Genesis 9 is explicitly linked to Genesis chapter 1. And if Moses defines the Genesis 9 fear and dread as related to nations, as animals, then that definition goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 1, just like Hosea 2:18 demonstrates as well. So Deuteronomy 11:25 provides a second witness and parallel proof for the covenant creation reading of both Genesis 1 and 9. And there are a lot of other texts that bear this out as well. Hosea 2, Jeremiah 27, you remember the creation there of nations. Jeremiah chapter 31, Isaiah 11, Zephaniah chapter 1, which all provide the creation context and definition related to Acts 10 with Peter's vision and then conversion of the Gentiles. So it applies both ways. The story of Acts 10 is related to Genesis 9, as Deuteronomy 11:25 shows decisively. Acts 10 is actually the antitype of Genesis 9:2. Well, how about another parallel from the song of Moses after the Red Sea crossing? Pharaoh's chariots and his army he has cast into the sea. His chosen captains were also drowned in the Red Sea. The people will hear and be afraid. Genesis chapter 9. Sorrow will take hold of the inhabitants of Philistia. Then the chiefs of Edom will be dismayed. The mighty men of Moab, trembling, will take hold of them. All the inhabitants of Canaan will melt away. Fear and dread will fall on them. Explicitly from Genesis 9:2. By the greatness of your arm, they will be as still as a stone till your people pass over, O Lord, till the people pass over whom you have purchased. Again, Moses spoke directly and explicitly from Genesis 9 about Israel's conquest. The animals are the nations of the land. Could covenant creation be any clearer? We'll watch how this story unfolds. From what Moses foretold regarding the upcoming conquest of the land of promise to the actual historical record that takes place with Joshua. Remember what Moses had said? This day I will begin to put the dread and fear of you upon the nations under the whole heaven. And that's flood language, Pentecost language. Who shall hear the report of you and shall tremble and be in anguish because of you? Well, here's what happened in Joshua. Now, before they lay down, she came up to them. This is Rahab in Jericho on the roof and said to the men, I know that the Lord has given you the land, Eretz, that the terror of you has fallen on us, and that all the inhabitants of the land, Eretz, are faint-hearted because of you. For we have heard the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites, who were on the other side of Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. And as soon as we heard these things, our hearts melted. Neither did there remain any courage in anyone because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. And they said to Joshua, truly the Lord has delivered all the land into our hands. Direct language from Genesis 9:2. For indeed, all the inhabitants of the country, Eretz, it gets translated so many different ways, are faint-hearted because of us. Now, what is introduced with Noah after the flood as the continuation and expansion of the original dominion mandate given to Adam lays the groundwork for all that takes place in the covenant world during Old Covenant history. The high point is the kingdom under the reign of David and Solomon, but the same priority of Israel over the nations, the man over the animals, comes up repeatedly in the Psalms. Oh, clap your hands, all you peoples, shout to God, Elohim, with the voice of triumph. For the Lord Most High, Yahweh, is awesome. He is a great king over all the earth. He will subdue the peoples under us and the nations under our feet. He will choose our inheritance for us, the excellence of Jacob, whom he loves. Psalm 47. Yet I have set my king on my holy hill of Zion. I will declare the decree. The Lord has said to me, you are my son. Adam and Israel are both God's son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will give you the nations for your inheritance and the ends of the earth for your possession. Psalm 110, the most quoted Old Testament passage in the New Testament. So dominion is presented in kingdom context as related to Adam, Israel, the pattern first introduced in Genesis chapter 1 and expanded in Genesis chapter 9. So we would see the flow of biblical history this way. Dominion mandate given to Adam, passed on to Noah, passed on to Abraham, and then to Israel. But what happened after Solomon died in Old Covenant history? Solomon broke covenant with his idolatry, and the kingdom was torn in two, just like the covenant stipulation required from cutting of the covenant with Abraham in Genesis 15. The animals divided in the covenant with Abraham meant this: if I break this covenant, I shall be divided in two, just like these sacrificial animals. And so Israel was divided after Solomon as required by the Abrahamic covenant terms. But Israel was not just torn in half due to covenant breaking. What else happened to Israel? Well, the animals of God's creation, doing God's purposes, began to eat Israel. The sea swallows Adam, Israel. Now the Lord had prepared a great fish to swallow Jonah, and Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. So God had made Assyria, who is a great fish of the sea. And if you remember back to Genesis chapter 1, God actually blessed the fish of the sea with the same blessing given to Adam, which prefigures the gospel blessing going to nations like Assyria, Babylon, Greece, Persia, Rome, the great Gentile sea that Daniel speaks of. Animals, though, eat Adam, Israel, in judgment for covenant breaking. It's not just Jonah. Notice this passage from Jeremiah. Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, has devoured me. He has crushed me. He has made me an empty vessel. He has swallowed me up like a monster. He has filled his stomach with my delicacies. He has spit me out. Or the Psalms. Why have you broken down her hedges? Speaking of Israel, so that all who pass by the way pluck her fruit. The boar out of the woods uproots it, and the wild beast of the field devours it. Jonah was to be a priest of Jehovah to Assyria, but like the people he represented, Israel, Jonah ran the other way from God's purposes and calling to be priest to the nations, just like Adam's job originally. And there are some really big implications there for part 4 to explore it more in depth. But Jonah, the Adam Israel prophet, becomes the symbol for what happens when Israel is swallowed up by Gentile nations, first with Assyria and the northern kingdom, then with Babylon and Judah. All Israel went into the belly of the fish of the sea, or the lion monster, and then all Israel was spit out again on dry land, symbolizing restoration and resurrection. And again, this is a typological fulfillment, for the true restoration of Israel is only found with the coming of Messiah. This detail all originates in Genesis 9 and Genesis chapter 1 with the dominion given to Adam Israel, which shows once again, at risk of repeating myself, that Genesis 9:2 refers to kingdom consumption and has nothing whatsoever to do with a generic biological diet related to individual human beings. This is a corporate context and a covenant story. To take that view is to completely miss the point of the story due to literalism, in much the same way that the Pharisees' literalism blinded them to the coming and teaching of Jesus Christ. Genesis 9:2 sets the whole scene in context for everything that follows in the story of God's covenant people during the Old Covenant creation, and even to Jesus, as we will see in our next episode. The reason I say that is because God always reestablishes his dominion mandate with the faithful. It's their covenant function as priests of God. We can see that explicit detail come up with the call of Jeremiah, which is Adamic, Noahic, Abrahamic, and Israelish in its language and detail. Consider Jeremiah chapter 1. Then the word of the Lord came to me, saying, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I sanctified you. I ordain you a prophet to the nations. Adam's original call that also echoes in Israel's history. Do not be afraid of their faces. reference to Genesis chapter 9, verse 2, because what had happened in Jeremiah's day is the order had been reversed. From the dominion order of Genesis 1 and Genesis 9, Israel now had fear and dread of the nations who ate them and took dominion over Adam, Israel. So Jeremiah is told, do not be afraid of their faces, for I am with you to deliver you, says the Lord. Then the Lord put forth his hand and touched my mouth. And the Lord said to me, behold, I have put my words in your mouth. That is echo of Deuteronomy chapter 32. See, I have this day set you over the nations and over the kingdoms. This is dominion, to root out and to pull down, to destroy and to throw down, to build and to plant. Jeremiah chapter 1. So Jeremiah and his friends continue as a true Adam Israel. So we can see that this is unfolding dominion going to Adam, to Noah, to Abraham, to Israel, to the prophets, and to Jesus. And this might be a little bit of review if you've seen the previous episodes, but it's appropriate to note again. And Jesus came and spoke to them, saying, all authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go therefore and make disciples of all the nations. Parallel text in Mark. And he said to them, go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. See how that works? The nations are the animals. So this Adamic dominion authority introduced in Genesis 1, restated in Genesis 9, and which played out all across Old Covenant history with Israel's elevated place above the nations to serve as God's priestly nation, comes to fulfillment with Jesus, who is given all authority in heaven and earth. This is the declaration of the triumphant last Adam during the last days of the Old Covenant creation. So Jesus fulfills the original dominion mandate by giving his disciples the Great Commission, which was fulfilled in that generation according to Matthew 24:14, when the gospel was preached to every creature, to every nation. This is the same story brought to its inevitable goal in Jesus Christ. And what I'm suggesting as far as the last days fulfillment of the Great Commission is actually explained this way by Max King. For Paul, Israel and the promise were to reach consummation in Christ in the imminent eschatological future. The pre-end of the age Gentile mission was the extension of God's promise to Israel, not the negation of it. Now, perhaps Max King doesn't see the origin as clearly related to Genesis 1 and Genesis 9. I have a video on Max King in Genesis 1 that I believe explains why he didn't start there with his covenant eschatology. I'll leave a link in the description if you want to check that out. But covenant creation simply extends his view in reverse to in the beginning of Genesis 1 as the old covenant creation. But Max King is absolutely correct about the fulfillment in Jesus Christ, who saves all the animals, all the nations, along with all Israel, mankind, together in the ark of salvation, the church, during the last days of the old covenant. And of course, that would be the end of the age judgment. The Great Commission has been completely fulfilled. Otherwise, the old creation would still be in operation and the last days would go on perpetually in our day and into our future, which is precisely what many partial preterists do in fact teach, right? They are looking forward to the fulfillment of the Great Commission in our future because of their non-covenantal understanding of the dominion mandate introduced in Genesis chapter 1. So I'll note here that many preterists who promote a futurist view of the Great Commission don't even realize how that is a blatant self-contradiction to their preterist eschatology, and it's incoherent as far as biblical theology is concerned. Why do they do that? Well, it's just mistaken traditionalism that they are very strongly attached to emotionally for one reason or another. But a futurist view of the Great Commission is absurd if you hold to preterist eschatology. And I get it. Traditions are hard to let go once people invest their lives and their entire ministries into them, but they won't last during the future as preterism continues to grow and establish itself on the theological scene. The Great Commission is nothing less than the creation of Genesis chapter 1, reaching its ordained goal or telos during the last days of the Old Covenant. And of course, Acts 2 and Pentecost, Acts 10 with Peter's vision, and Paul's missionary journeys all find their place naturally within that covenant context rooted in Genesis chapter 1. My conclusion from this is that the whole story of Noah's rest and Adam's dominion can be understood properly only in covenant context as the old covenant creation introduced in Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God created, bara, the heavens and the earth. So when we read statements in Genesis chapter 8, while the earth remains, right? That's a qualification. We know that this earth is going to pass away at the end of the age, according to Hebrews 1:10 and 11, 2 Peter 3, Revelation 21:1. Noah's earth is going to pass away at the end of the age. It is implied from Genesis 1:1 and the beginning, which anticipates the end of Bible eschatology. Futurism simply misunderstands the central typology of the Bible as related to ultimate fulfillment in Jesus Christ. Because Jesus not only finished the work of salvation, he also brought into being the new covenant, a new heavens and new earth that would manifest itself in finality when the Genesis 1 creation passed away by AD 70. And I'll conclude with this citation from James B. Jordan, who absolutely nails the big picture with this explanation. Let us be clear about this. The destruction of the temple and of Jerusalem was not merely the end of the Hebrew, Israelite, Jewish period of history that began with Abraham. It was the end of the entire old creation from Adam forward. The church is the replacement not merely of Israel, but also the older and larger Gentile world that began with Adam and continued through the Noahic covenant. The kingdom of Jesus is a wholly new creation and nothing less. That's from James B. Jordan, Matthew 23 through 25, a literary, historical, and theological commentary. And the chapter is titled The Judgment of the Old Creation. You can get this book from American Vision. But that beautiful statement has profound implications for modern culture, Christian worldview, and the future of biblical theology. Preterism confirms the big picture view of what Jordan claims above, and it is nothing less than revolutionary. So I'm confident that this entire covenant creation curriculum series has provoked many questions for you so far. Some of the implications will be explored in the next video segment, which concludes part 2. The title of that upcoming video will be The Everlasting Reign of the Man. From there, we will move into part 3 and a deep look at the garden scene of Genesis 2 through 3 in covenant context. And that'll take a few videos to go through that material. And I'm very excited about that because some of that detail is absolutely fascinating. Then part 4 will be focused on the theological, cultural, and worldview implications more in depth, just so you are informed of my direction with this work on YouTube. I hope it has made sense so far, and just be aware we have a lot of material still to come before we reach the end of part 4. And I still do envision a part 5, which deals with individual questions that you might have once the presentation and discussion is fully complete. We can do individual episodes on specific questions and related details, that don't actually get covered in the current curriculum material. But thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to this channel. Until next time, my name is Tim Martin with Covenant Creation on YouTube. Blessings.